start with just a little bit of Linux. I find that a lot of people who start out, including me, when I started pen testing, don't have a lot of Linux experience. I had maybe used it twice, honestly, and a lot of the course material that I was looking at just assumed that I already knew Linux. So I do want to start with just a little bit of Linux. You can follow this course just with this much Linux, but I would encourage you, if you're going to continue with pen testing, whatever works for you, a class, a book, just using it in your everyday life, to get familiar with Linux, because a lot of the tools for pen testing are Linux only. I mean, there are some that do have a Windows version. There's even some that are Windows only, but primarily a lot of your developers for particularly your open source tools, that is going to be Linux based. So it's certainly worth knowing. And I mean, on top of that, you'll probably run into some Linux targets. I mean, people generally use Windows for their workstations, but a lot of your servers, databases, websites, things like that are going to be Linux based, so you'll probably need to know some Linux. In fact, we have a Linux target in our environment here, as well as some Windows ones. So I'm starting out here on my Kali Linux, and again, the password for that is tour, so login root, and then password tour, so root backwards, and that's the default, which you are, of course, welcome to change if you want to. Just remember what it is. And I already have my command line open. Let's get rid of that. So up here at the top, this is our terminal. So we can just open that up here. And you can, if you want to, make it bigger so you can view, zoom in, which of course you don't have to, but it makes it nicer on the screen, right? That might be a bit much. How about that? And you can also change the colors and opacity and things, so you could get rid of the dragon, which I generally do for screenshots in my report, so it doesn't have part dragon in there, which kind of looks a little silly out of context. So that's our Linux command line. So we can do anything on this system straight from the command line, and it's, at least in my opinion, a good deal easier to use than the Windows command line. I mean, PowerShell in Windows is pretty nice, and we'll look at PowerShell briefly later in the class, but on our older Windows systems, we don't have PowerShell, so we're stuck with a certain amount of unhappiness if we end up with command line access to a Windows system, unless we're really good with the Windows command line. I think the Linux command line is much easier to deal with, so we can put in our commands. For instance, we could do pwd. So that's just a command. It's short for print working directory. Our default directory, since we are the user root, is /root. And we can find out more information about a command with something called the man pages. So man, short for manual. So man, pwd, would have more information. Print the name of the current working directory. There's also some additional options. Another one would be man ls. List directory contents, list information about the files. It also has some options like -a will do not ignore entries starting with a dot, so it won't ignore hidden directories. Lots of other ones here. Let's see, grab one more. -l, use a long listing format, so a different format for the output. So, say I want to do, ls, let's just start with the root. So that's going to be the root of the file system, that /, and see our working directory here was /root, so that's in roots directory, but let's do an ls on the root. So there's all our directories in the root, so you can kind of think of the Linux file system as a tree, so we've got root to / at the top, and then it's got all these branches, and some of these are directories, here's our root directory. We've got some other ones as well. User, var, sys, temp, mount, opt, media, lib, home, lots of stuff. So we could also do ls-a. That'll show us. It doesn't look like we have many hidden directories here. We just have the dot, which is the current directory, and the dot, which is the parent. And we can also do -l for the long format, so this shows us additional information. So what does all this mean, I wonder? So what we have here is, this is actually the file permissions on each of these files. So we have read, write, execute, read, write, execute, read, write, execute. So 3 different groups. We'll get to that in just a second. And then we have, I think that's how many links there are to it. And then the owner, the group, the size, and last modified date, and then the name. So a little bit more information there. And we can navigate around the file system. Like, again, we're still at /root. If I wanted to go to, say, root, I could do cd/ change directory, cd. Again, we can do man cd. Oh, there is no man entry for cd. So that one we might have to check out the internet for more information. We can always Google as well. Man pages can be a little bit unattractive to read. So sometimes the internet is easier. Either way. And so we can also do, I'll just go back to /root. We can also do, like if I wanted to do cd ... remember that ... is the parent. So that'll be the equivalent of cd root, because we're in /root. So that'll take me to the parent, which is going to be root. So /. Yay. So let's see, let's go back to root again. We can also do cd onto root's desktop. And I could do like cd ... So that'll take me 2 parents up. So that'll take me back to root and go into a different directory. So like Etsy, one of my ones on root here. Like here's Etsy. So if I want to go to the Etsy directory, I can do that. So now I'm in Etsy. So we can move around. Again, you can kind of think of it as a tree. You don't have to be familiar with like where everything is and what all of the directories mean. Really, you can just know that you're in your root directory or /root, your home directory for root by default, and the / is the beginning of the file system. Like mount is where we mount drives. Temp is temporary files. There's lots of different things in there. So, user privileges, how about that? So again, we are user root. So our home directory is /root. There's also /home we saw. Home actually doesn't have anything in it right now. Kali Linux is an interesting Linux system in that it only has the root user, which is fairly uncommon for Linux. A best practice for using Linux is to do all everyday today tasks as an unprivileged user and only use root, which is equivalent of system on Windows. So you're almighty, completely controlling the file system user for activities that require root privileges. So that way hopefully we wouldn't manage to destroy anything. If we're root all the time and then say I used a command called rm, so if I went into root and I said rm-rf and I let that run, what would happen is that I would actually delete my entire file system. So it's actually kind of a joke that you see on hacking boards all the time, and it's like, teach me how to hack. Tell people to go into their Linux system and do a rm-rf, so that's going to tell it to force recursively remove files, so it's going to actually remove the entire file system in that case, because it's from the root directory, and since we're root, that would be perfectly legal. There would be nothing to stop that. We have that privilege. Whereas if I was just a normal user, I wouldn't be able to just delete the file system. I'd only be able to access files that I have permissions to work with. So that's a pretty good example of why we shouldn't use root all the time. Kali's a little bit different. It's not, for one, an everyday use operating system. It's specifically built for pen testing And most pen test tools actually are going to require root privileges. They set up network sockets and listen on the network and crack passwords and all sorts of other things. So, not everything is going to require root privileges, but a fair amount of them do. So I guess it just makes it easier. I didn't write Kali, but that's, as far as I can remember, always been the case, is that it's always been a root user. Of course, we can add another user if we want to, and it may not be necessary for Kali, but if you are working with other Linux systems, you'll probably have some other user that is not root. We do add user, and I'll just do Georgia. Enter a password for Georgia. I always use password for these examples. That's a really terrible password. I realize that. You should never use the same passwords that I use in production. But use a better password than password, but remember what it is, of course. Then you can fill in these values. I always just leave them blank. Is this information correct? Yes. So now we have a user called Georgia, whose password is password in my case. So what we can do is I could change users to that user Georgia. So I'm going to do a su Georgia. And that made me the user Georgia. You can see my prompt has changed here. Now I'm Georgia at Kali. So now if I wanted to do an add user, say James. Says the add user command doesn't exist. But we know it does, we just used it. Well, Georgia doesn't have root privileges. Georgia has limited user privileges. So Georgia actually doesn't have the ability to add users to the file system. Nor should she, as just a regular user. So what we would need to do in this case is actually use something called sudo, or sudo. Let me exit and go back to root. So I did exit, and that took me back to my root prompt. And what I want to do is add Georgia to the sudoer group. So groups are just groups of users. A user can be in multiple groups, and one such group is the sudoers, and that is people who are allowed to basically pretend to be root. These users can basically request root privileges on a temporary basis so they can perform commands such as add user. So what I want to do as root is do add user again, and then Georgia, and then I want to add Georgia into sudo. That added Georgia into the sudo group. So now if I drop back down to Georgia, and instead of doing add user James, where it says command not found, I do sudo add user James. It gives me a little warning about using sudo. It does in fact give us root privileges. We can do bad things with it. We should not. Then it prompts me for my password. I don't have to have the root password for this. I need to have Georgia's password, which is, in my case, password. So then that allows us to use the add user command. So we could add this user James to the file system. So then, after we've done sudo, we lose our root privileges immediately. So it's only for that one command that we keep those root privileges. So now we're back to being a normal user. So hopefully we won't be able to destroy the file system now.